pipe up with something like, the camera's on now, so don't repeat what you just said earlier.
Yeah.
Was that your VC?
It's just me, it's just me.
Okay. Okay, so this is the third time I've been to Manchester, and they've all been excellent. First time England thrashed Germany, a long time ago. Second time AFC Wimbledon got promoted to the Football League, and it's been a great day here as well. So hopefully I will keep that up.
So England are going to win the World Cup?
Now, you never know, you never know.
Highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely. And I want to thank Richard and colleagues for inviting me as well, because I think events like this are really crucial to share the best practice, and so far I've picked up a load of tips. And I've been to a few industry things where often there's a little bit of bashing of higher education and how we deliver web teaching. And I know there are some bad practice out there, sure, but I know there's a lot of good practice, so this event I'm really pleased to be here. Okay, so this is the hashtag that we use for the project. You can use it now. If you want to kind of talk about the project, I'm going to go through a case study about how we basically take 60 to 70 students from zero best practice HTML to mobile first hand-coded websites in 5 weeks. Show you how we do it and give you some ideas, and hopefully we can give you some, and there's a few bits I think need working on, etc. All the slides are online here, so if you're going to make a note of anything, definitely note down that URL. I've got a whole load of slides. You don't need to capture the stuff that's on all the slides. Some of it's just references to the project. Feel free to download them, Creative Commons license, remix them, use them, digest at your own leisure. So
I will coordinate all the slides and things.
yeah,
Fantastic.
Cool.
Thank you.
Take that, I'm on leave for the next 2 weeks, so I'll be after that.
Okay, so I'm just going to give you some background and context to the project so that you understand why we run it the way that we do and how we run it. So it is the first project that our graphic arts students do in year 2. So it's the very first project they come back to doing, and they are BA graphic arts students who are doing the graphic design pathway. So at this point they've chosen that pathway, and we also include the motion graphic students now as well. And like I said, it's about 60 or 70 students. So in year 1, we do a whole bunch of workshop-based projects that are studio-based, where we cover all of the graphic arts and graphic design fundamentals. So we've got things around composition and thinking about that, obviously. We have a whole bunch of stuff on typography. Students go and make type, etc., print things. And we do a lot of stuff that's obviously print-based in the first year, that really covers all those kind of fundamentals that we need all of our graphic arts students to understand. The grid, layout, typography, and also the printed medium. So a lot of InDesign, those kind of things. And this is some of the work that they create. Like I said, a lot of it tends to revolve around the printed medium. So we do a lot of zines, and we have lots of kind of exhibitions, and we do a whole bunch of sort of research methodology stuff. So making sketchbooks, etc. So it means by the time they get to kind of year 2, we've covered those fundamentals. We've really hammered home typography, grids, layout, composition. As an aside, I've got a few books that I'll throw in. These 2 books aren't necessarily ones I use in the teaching, but I think they are worth having on your bookshelf if you're teaching any web design, because they talk about web design without talking about too much of the technicalities. Now, Andrew Clark's book, that one's a little bit older, Mark Bolton's book. Both of those are quite nice in that they just talk about designing for the web as a platform. And that, for our students, because they're art students, is a really big thing. The final week of the first year, we run a 1-week project, not assessed, using Mozilla's, what was called Hackosaurus, but it's now called Goggles, and I keep calling it Googles. Which is a tool that lets you kind of hack up a website, and we just run a 1-week project where they subvert an existing piece of web content. So it introduces them to inspecting those elements, and we were fortunate enough to launch that this week. Sid Lawrence, who lives in Winchester and works in Winchester, came in and talked about how his company makes really cool stuff, and we kicked it off with making loads of memes. So at the moment that hashtag is predominantly full of memes with me doing something ridiculous that the students have decided is the best way to start that content. And by the end of the week, they're just going to present in a lecture theatre on a projector some subverted content. So hopefully they're going to turn BP into something that's about planning or whatever, and try and avoid any kind of UKIP danger zones where we might get sued. Okay, so the project starts in first week of year 2, and the project is about discovering an obsession. So finding an obsession and then sharing that obsession with the world. And so that is what our project is all about, is going and looking at a large entity. So we give them a list of entities. This is just a bunch of list. And we say, well, what you do is investigate that large entity and look for something small, some minutiae element that you can obsess over, and then we want you to share that obsession with the world through a web project. And the project is split into 2 parts. Part 1 is predominantly research driven, and part 2 is actually make the thing. Okay? Part 1, I'll just point out, it's about coming up with a persona, giving a presentation, and part 2 is making it, designing and implementing, and we call it linked content. We're trying to avoid using the word page everywhere we can, because they come from a very print background, and we really don't want them to make magazine websites. And certainly at this point, we don't want them to make portfolio sites. I mean, they can use Squarespace or whatever they want for that purpose. This is about thinking about the web as a platform. Part 1 is 2 weeks, and part 2 is 3 weeks. This is how it looks, and I'm going to talk through some of the workshops. As you can imagine, we do have to run some of these workshops twice a day, that kind of stuff, because of the numbers. But the general idea is that, although part 1 is the research driven, we do start with HTML right at the beginning here in workshop 1. They give a presentation. The talks are kind of critical context talks, talking around user experience, design, responsive. We've got a prototype day, and then we have a crit at the end where they project the finished product. It has to be a website, but they don't actually hand in at that point. They hand in at the end of the semester. The project ends and they start a new project, but they can fiddle around with it afterwards if they want to. Okay, so part 1 is just really about content gathering, doing some research, and we run through a whole demo with them at the beginning to launch this project, where we give them an idea of how they might do it. So Justin has created this demo, which is about looking at Coast as the large entity, and then building up a bunch of sketchbook work. So this is all about sketchbook work, researching what Coast might mean, looking for basic primary research stuff, and then trying to narrow it down to something they could obsess over. So he starts kind of focusing on ice cream trucks, looking at combs, maybe the combs, and starting to come up and build like a visual identity for this obsession. Okay? And we can't get them to keep asking themselves what they're looking at, why they're looking at, who it might be for, where it's come from, those kind of things. And just get them to do that in the first 2 weeks. Andrew Clark talks about this as designing atmosphere. Brad Frost talks about atomic design, where you're creating those bits. And that for our students is really, really crucial. So we get them to focus on these things in the first 2 weeks. Our contextual talks, obviously Don Norman features a lot, talk about Harold Balkin, and we also get them to think in that research stage about the fact that this thing might exist on a device, that there's kind of power within that, and then they might have some extra things they can play with that could change how that obsession works. They're obsessing over rain or whatever, it could play a role in the fact that the device knows what the weather is in the location they're in. And we get them to output in those first 2 weeks a style tile, so that's using that style tiles, which is really, really nice. And thinking about these user interface elements. So we tend to use Sketch to help them kind of build those bits. So it's again building these little bits and pieces. And our focus really is about that experience. So I really like this kind of quote here. But that's what we're going to think about, is what is the experience we're going to get out there and how we're going to share this obsession. Okay, so they give a presentation in 2 weeks. That tends to be the style tile, maybe a bit of sketchbook work, some of the visual identity, and also some of the thoughts of who's it for, what's the persona, and a little bit of content organisation. They might do some layout at this point, using InDesign or whatever they want to. They might just do a sketch. Doesn't really matter. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so the workshops are across all 5 weeks, so we're going to rewind a little bit and say, okay, let's just focus on the workshops. That's what I want to tell you about, predominantly. I run most of the workshops currently and assume 0 best practice. My daughter at high school recently said, "Oh, we're doing a web design project." I said, "Oh, what are you learning?" Dreamweaver and Photoshop. It didn't go well from that point onwards. But she handed in a Dreamweaver thing and learned nothing. Anyway. So I assume zero best practice still currently. This book is I use this as the course book, basically. This book is awesome. I've only had it for a few years. It's fantastic. And this podcast that Jennifer's on, the Webhead 5x5 TV, this episode is amazing. She talks about what might you do if you went back to look at HTML without knowing all the bad stuff that we had to go through, tables and whatever, and how might you think about it differently, and gets quite excited about the web as a platform. As an aside, all these books are included in a lot of the content stuff, the 5 simple steps, the Book of Heart stuff. The pocket guides are unbelievably great. Like £2 for an EPUB or whatever, they are amazing.
Too cheap.
Yeah. The students love it.
I say that as an author.
Yeah.
Way too cheap.
They are great, and I'm so glad that 5 Simple Steps got rebought or out or whatever happened, and they're going to carry on. I'm going to talk to them again about that because they are fantastic. Okay, so this is a great quote from Future Web Design this year, just now, a couple of weeks ago. I think this is really, really important, especially. These are Brad Frost's photos, and we've got this device diversification. That's really important. Have to hammer home to the students, it's not print design. Definitely still pick up the John Alsop article. It was made loads of time ago, but it's fantastic. And also, it's not just those devices, screens and whatever. It's these kind of things. This is a little printer in my office. This is my Pebble watch. The content is being pushed in all kinds of ways that the students can't imagine. There's no control. So it's really great. And get those things out in the sessions. That's what, get the little printer doing something, get the Pebble watch doing something. The students love it. And Andrew Clark talks again here. He's got this design should find my culture to communicate the meaning of the design, and that's kind of the basis for the big chunk of our stuff. So a lot of people started using this layers of change to represent things, and I thought, well, I'm going to use it as well. It's quite cool. This is what we worry about for the 5 weeks. Okay, we worry about teaching HTML for meaning, CSS for style, and maybe some JavaScript. We're lucky, icing on the cake. Yeah, but I certainly don't go anywhere near any of this. We don't teach editors. I'll show you what we use. We don't teach the editors. We definitely don't teach any of these things. They all change. Certainly, we're talking about frameworks. So I'll mention that. There's some really good stuff that Richard's always talked about. Some pattern libraries can be a problem as well for the same sort of reasons that I think have already been brought up. So we focus just on these things because they don't change that often, as we can testify, although it's a relatively short time frame the industry's kind of existed. Okay, so the workshops are all 2 hours each. Sounds long, but it's pretty good if you break it up and do things. So workshops 1 and 2 is purely about focusing, application and meaning. And we definitely use all the HTML5 ones. We don't even use stuff because we're just talking to designers really. So we just look at how we focus on meaning. And basically I get the students to bring up the Mozilla Developer Network HTML reference page, which is fantastic for just giving you a brief bit of blurb about what the meaning of those elements are. And I just give them massive A3 handouts of content and say, right, look at this content, here it is. And I get up on the whiteboard and I scribble and say, let's have a semantic conversation about what this content means. And because a lot of these are printed publications, the H1 always ends up right at the bottom, which is great because then you're not talking about style, you're talking about meaning. It really starts to break that down. And I just give them a bunch of different content. That's the week, and there's loads of little bits in there. You've got sites, cues, and just get them to do that in pairs or threes. So because the one thing that I really enjoy is having that semantic conversation about semantics and saying, and especially when it comes to HTML5 elements like sections, articles, asides. You can have a great conversation and the students then build from those basic elements then onto the kind of structural elements, these ones here, and it's really good fun. So I'd recommend definitely doing that. Obviously these are all, there's a 442 magazine on Wimbledon Football Club, obviously, throwing any references to Wimbledon where I can. And a long time ago, again, Andrew Clark talked about this designing a CSS DVD, and he talked about just getting a pages document and kind of outlining what the content means. So really, really useful. And if, at that point, if we get them to do any coding, I get them to use Mozilla's Thimble. And I'm probably not going to get a chance to talk too much about Mozilla's tools, but their WebMaker tools are getting fantastic. And I really like this because what they see is code on the left and the design thing on the right. Yeah, the browser output in one screen. And I give them like a demo file that just has loads of comments in there they can just work through. And they can just remix it. So you just hit a remix button. That's the URL for the remix. By all means, grab that later on and look at it and have a look. It's just it's a single HTML document, bunch of comments just saying this means this, and they can just then focus on the bit in the middle. And it does mean that it's content focused. And I think for free, then we get accessibility and we also get mobile first, which is nice. Okay, workshop 3. Yeah, so we've gone through 4 hours of HTML. This is when we do talk about HTML in a desktop editor. We use Espresso. I like it a lot. A lot of people possibly don't like it, but the thing for me, and if they say we're going to use, again, I'm talking from an art school perspective, it's really nice because again you can move from having code and the design. It really helps you design in the browser. So it stops them from using InDesign or Photoshop or whatever, because they can tweak around with the content and see the changes here. And Espresso even live updates the HTML changes, which I don't think any others do, unless you kind of have a refresh plugin thing going, and it gets a bit confusing with Chrome and brackets, possibly. Anyway, I like it, and you've got lots of nice things you can inspect the elements.
BB Edit.
Yeah, BB Edit is great, I have to admit. And I know, again, a lot of the stuff I do here, which is good, is that this is how I teach web design. It's not actually how I necessarily build a website, which I've kind of come, having to prepare these slides, has kind of reinforced it in my head, which is quite interesting. I think that's the key, and a few people have mentioned that already. I do use HTML5 boilerplate. I remove some stuff that they don't need to know, but I really like it because it's not a framework. It's just a well-structured set of folders, really, that they can take into an Espresso project, and I can explain site structure to the students really, really quickly. It's not Bootstrap, it's not a pattern library, it's not going to produce these remoulded websites that look all the same, which is quite nice. So that's what I use to kickstart the project. I also build, from Justin's kind of research, I've already built a pre-finished version of his obsession over ice cream trucks. Yeah, and I make it mobile first, and the students get that project, and they can download it and look at the elements, etc. And I just use that HTML5 boilerplate to explain site structure predominantly, and it's already there for free. Yeah. That's the project page. Does need updating. I'm probably going to send it to a GitHub page now after today, for sure. Again, you can download a couple of the bits and pieces from there. I want to turn that into something where the finished products are live at the end, but I've yet to kind of manage that process. But I think, again, Richard was talking about portfolio at the end. I think that's a really good idea. But I think I'm going to turn this into a GitHub thing now, which I'm probably going to need to find out how to do a bit more to GitHub pages.
We can do that on the train.
Exactly, I'll be done. Okay, so in 2 weeks they know HTML, in theory, and they're doing the presentation at the same time. Okay? We then have a prototype day. So the first day of week 3, we basically get them together, again in groups, to look at one of the things they've been researching and start doing paper prototyping. So I do a quick demo and try and do one up on the screen. We pin these things up, get some boards, get a bunch of staff in, and we just start scribbling stuff down and get away from doing any design this near the computer, obviously. Yeah? Get them in and start thinking, just, how might they start to obsess. And a lot of stuff does end up being quite, they go, I think I'm making an app. And I'm like, well, no, you're making a web app. Sure, maybe it's just for mobile, maybe that's the audience you're after. So they get quite excited because they just go, actually, these skills are, quite interesting. And they enjoy that day, and it really kicks them off to start thinking about, okay, how might I actually make this thing? Okay, how are we doing for time? Not too bad. Workshop 4, 2 hours of basic CSS. The Zen Garden is still, for me, is the best way to explain style, style and content completely separate. And it just instantly, 5 minutes, bang, they get it. even before it was updated, and the updated one with the archive thing is even better. So really, really good. And then a lot of this stuff is big whiteboard stuff, focus on that we're going to define how the element's going to look now, that kind of stuff. And just kind of start scribbling things down, and it just go whiteboard crazy, I reckon, for this. A lot of these examples are in that Learning Web Design book, and I use those to kind of get it going. And again, with Espresso, the nice thing is that you can, again, design in the browser, and Espresso has this CSS panel, so I don't need to talk to them about CSS programming, if you want to call it that, because they kind of just start fiddling with these bits here. Okay, now I'm not getting students to create production-ready code, okay, so, but they start to see it being built on the side, so they can start to connect the dots, and I've scribbled on a whiteboard, and we have a Q&A thing, and do some little questions. Workshop 5, layout and positioning, this is going to be good, because I've already got some good ideas. So I use this book because it explains absolute relative, and I just read it. I just read what she's written in the book because it explains it really, really well. It is the most demanding workshop. It is a nightmare to explain that kind of stuff. Go whiteboard crazy. I did mention REMS at one point. That was probably a bad idea. And maybe do some dummy div examples of things moving around. It's hard work though, that one. And yeah. Workshop 6. Media queries and web queries.
You like break their legs. They can't go anywhere.
I definitely avoid using the word media queries, using the word breakpoints, so I talk about the design breaking, so we start squeezing the browser and see what happens. We certainly work small screen first, 320 pixels we kind of start with, keep your content focused, and then start pulling to see what happens. So, okay, at this point it's starting to break, now we need to add a breakpoint, let's start doing that with those very simple media queries. At this point it does mean that if it goes wrong, they've still got a nice 320 thing that works. And maybe they just take the breakpoints out, just leave it fixed. The wrapper is 320 pixels or whatever. Yeah. Did at one point, probably a couple of years ago, attempt to explain this, and I read it from Ethan's book, and I stood there, and it's a nightmare. It is a nightmare to talk to our design students about any kind of math, even the most simple. So this proved to be really, really difficult. It's not bad if they're starting with pixels and trying to do that conversion, because it's not too bad, but even I end up getting confused about what was context and whatever. This might save the day, maybe. I'm not sure. I've read it obviously a couple of times. I'm thinking there's some really interesting stuff in it. This year we used GridSet, which changed the game completely actually, and made it a lot easier for the layout staff, made it a lot easier to run media queries. Obviously GridSet has been bought by Monotype. They gave us a 3-month trial for students. Obviously that's all changed now because they've been bought out, so I'm not sure where I want to go with the grid thing yet. But I found that was really, really good. So yeah, hopefully they're kind of going to bring it into typecast. I don't know, we'll see. Because that's the last workshop that we do, is talk about web fonts. And we don't really talk about JavaScript. They all want to do it, but it's a nightmare. Yeah? They're like, oh, how do I get this thing? And I'm like, whoa. We do a little bit of CSS animation now because the motion graphics students, and that's getting easier and easier. For web fonts, we use Typecast. Again, they gave us a 3-month trial as well. Again, an education thing. So I suspect that we can still kind of tap into that. So students get 3 months of it not having to pay, and then they can carry on if they want. And that's got some really good stuff happening now with responsive design, but I don't know how it necessarily translates into some of the teaching. But it gives them the idea that there is these web fonts exist. And then finally, that's the last tool that I use, is CodePen. Maybe JSBin, you could use it either or, and you can just set up your own account, and you can just make really simple dummy examples that students can look at, and they come to you on like the last kind of a big sign-up day, and they go, I want to do this, and it does end up being a bit of JavaScript, and I go, oh, I can do that. So I give them those little bits of code for free, and it's quite nice, and you do most of that without having a pro account, which is quite cool. And again, it gets them to break down the problems into small little easy chunks, which is quite nice. and I'll just show you some of the stuff that they have made. And by the end of it, like I said, with 60 or 70 students by the end of the project, they have to show linked content sites on the projector. That's the crib, and they all do it. 2 years ago, before we started running it this way, I wasn't sure if it was possible, and it is possible. So, I mean, some of the programs here have got a lot longer time, and I'm not talking about, I'm not sending web designers necessarily into the industry. I'm talking about people who've got an understanding of front-end development, who can work as designers in all kinds of different ways. So this one is an obsession over the different types of plugs that you find across Europe. Started off with the power network. So on a mobile you get like a single strip, on the desktop you get like a world map view, those kind of things. Really simple stuff, but really nice. This one was about, I think started with the British Library, ended up digging into Alice in Wonderland and using some of the objects in that. These all spin CSS animations, which is great, and then again, single column on a mobile. This one is food. I don't know where they started this one. This is about boot prints. So maybe in a space, maybe starting in NHS, the halls of an NHS, the boot prints people leave. Who knows? That one's all the weird electrical appliance signs, and this one I like. That's all the weird patterns you find on trains and stuff like that. Now, because I'm on video, see, I have to thank certain members of staff. It's not I run the project, but it's not just me. It's a team of people. Paul and Justin really kind of key in helping run this project. And that was a whistle-stop tour of how we run a project at Winchester School of Art to get loads of people making websites. Thank you very much.
That was amazing.
Yeah.